He wasn't supposed to survive. The words hung in the air like a cold whisper. In the dim light of his small, forgotten home, Marine John Davis sat motionless, staring at the old wooden floor beneath him. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling around him. Then, it came again, a faint scratching, like something was trying to get out. His heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it was just the wind, maybe a rodent, but as the scratching grew louder, more desperate, a strange feeling crept up his spine. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to check. He leaned forward, his hand trembling slightly as it touched the floor. The scratch continued, louder now, as if pleading for attention. Something, or someone, was under there. Taking a deep breath, John knelt beside the floorboards, his pulse quickening. He hadn't expected this. As he pried up the boards, the air around him seemed to grow colder. The hole beneath was small, just enough for a body to fit. He could barely make out a shape, but there, huddled in the dark, was a small German shepherd puppy, shivering with fear. The pup's wide amber eyes locked onto John's, and for a moment, neither moved. Then, as if knowing that John was there to help, the puppy let out a soft whimper, its tiny body trembling. John's heart broke. How had it ended up here, abandoned and alone? It looked like it hadn't eaten in days, its fur matted and dirty, its ribs clearly visible under the thin coat. With a steady hand, John reached in, carefully pulling the little dog from the cramped space. The pup didn't struggle, just let out another weak whimper before nuzzling into John's chest, as if it had found the first bit of warmth and comfort it had known in days. John's mind raced. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew enough to realize that this dog wasn't going to make it if he didn't act fast. With no time to waste, he wrapped the puppy in his jacket and rushed to the car, praying that it wasn't too late. The cold, harsh wind of the outside world hit him as he stepped out of the house, but he barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was the small life in his arms, the fragile being that had somehow found its way into his life. The drive to the animal clinic was a blur. He couldn't stop looking down at the puppy, the soft rise and fall of its chest, a small but steady reminder that it was still fighting to survive. He was too late for so many things in his life, too many battles lost, too many pieces of himself left behind in the dust of past wars. But this felt different. This was a fight worth having. The moment they arrived, he rushed inside, his heart racing in his chest. The vet, an older woman with kind eyes, took one look at the puppy and immediately went to work, her hands quick and sure. She hooked the puppy up to and for, administered fluids, and began checking its vitals. John stood there, frozen, watching as the small body lay on the examination table, a steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. "He's a fighter," the vet finally said, her voice soft but confident. "He's going to be okay." The relief that washed over John was almost overwhelming. The small puppy had survived the night, and with the help of this skilled vet, it was going to make it. As the puppy slowly regained strength, John couldn't help but smile. He had no idea what the future held for him or this little dog, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, this was the miracle he hadn't realized he was waiting for. As the days passed, John couldn't shake the image of that small, trembling puppy from his mind. He had seen many things during his time in the military, things that still haunted him when the nights grew long and the silence became unbearable. But this felt different. The puppy, now resting in the makeshift bed John had set up by the fireplace, was a reminder of something pure, something he had almost forgotten in the chaos of his life. The small dog, which John had named Shadow, had fought for its life in the most desperate of circumstances. And now, John was fighting for it. Shadow had started to show small signs of recovery. It would wag its tail whenever John walked into the room. Its eyes would light up with recognition, and it had started eating again, though just a little at a time. John could see the change, the spark of life returning to the small animal he had brought back from the brink. One evening, as John sat by the fire, Shadow limped over to him, its small body still weak but determined. It rested its head on John's knee, and for a moment, there was nothing but the quiet crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the puppy. John reached down and stroked its fur, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're one tough little guy," John muttered under his breath, feeling a sense of connection with the small creature. It was as if Shadow understood him, as if it had become more than just a dog to him. It was a companion, a friend, and perhaps, in some strange way, a reflection of his own struggle. As the days turned into weeks, Shadow continued to heal. John kept his distance at times, not wanting to overwhelm the little dog with too much attention, but always close enough to offer comfort when needed. It wasn't long before John realized something. He had begun to care for Shadow, truly care for him. In the mornings, they would go for short walks around the property. Shadow, though still not fully recovered, would trot beside him, its tail wagging. John found himself laughing at the way the puppy would leap after a stick, its energy slowly returning. For the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace, something he had desperately missed. Shadow was becoming more than just a companion. He was a symbol of resilience, of hope, of a new beginning. As the winter months began to melt away, John could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Shadow was growing stronger every day, and with that strength came a bond that John could never have anticipated. He had never expected to find comfort in an animal, never thought he could care for something beyond his own pain and grief. But Shadow had changed that. The little dog had shown him that there was more to life than the battles he had fought, more than the scars that marked his body and soul. There was still room for love, for healing, for the quiet moments that mattered. And in return, John promised to never leave Shadow behind, to give him the life he deserved. Together, they would face the future, one step at a time, both of them stronger for the struggles they had endured. As the days stretched into weeks, John could feel a change within himself, one that he hadn't expected. The mornings, once filled with the cold weight of loneliness, now carried a sense of purpose. Shadow, now fully recovered and growing stronger by the day, had become a fixture in John's life. The little dog, with its dark, sleek coat and intelligent amber eyes, was more than just a companion. It was a reminder that life could still surprise him, that there was more to look forward to than the past. One crisp morning, as John stood by the window, looking out over the wide expanse of land surrounding his home, Shadow trotted up beside him, his tail wagging in rhythm with the gentle breeze. It had become their routine. John would wake up early, take a moment to drink his coffee, and then head outside for a walk with Shadow. The bond between them had grown deeper than either of them could have anticipated. They had become partners in healing, each of them working through their own battles, silently supporting each other. On one of these walks, as they strolled along the tree-lined path near the edge of the property, John paused for a moment, looking out at the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and for the first time in a long time, John felt at peace. Shadow sat down beside him, resting his head on John's knee as if to say, "I'm here." John smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his. "We've come a long way, haven't we, buddy?" John whispered softly. It was in this quiet moment that John realized just how much Shadow had brought into his life. The pain from his past, the scars from the battles he had fought, both on the field and within himself, no longer held the same weight. Shadow had helped him rediscover the simple joys in life, things he thought he had lost forever. Over time, their bond deepened. John found himself sharing more of his thoughts with Shadow, speaking to him about the things that had been weighing on his mind. It wasn't the same as talking to a human, but there was something about Shadow's unwavering presence that made it feel like he was truly being heard. One evening, as the sun began to set and the first stars started to appear in the sky, John sat on the porch with Shadow by his side. The cool air carried the faint scent of pine and earth, and the world around them seemed to slow down. It was in these quiet moments that John felt the most alive. Shadow had given him a sense of connection that he had longed for, a reminder that no matter how isolated he had felt, there was always something worth fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, John knew one thing for certain. He had found his purpose again. He had found it in the most unlikely place, in a small, abandoned puppy who had fought for its life. Together, they had healed each other, and in doing so, they had created a bond that nothing could break. As the seasons continued to change, John began to realize how much his life had shifted since Shadow had come into it. The once quiet, empty house now felt like a home. He had found solace in the presence of the small dog who had become his constant companion. Shadow had brought with him a sense of peace that John had longed for, but never thought he would find again. One chilly afternoon, as the trees around the property began to shed their leaves, John decided to take Shadow for a longer walk than usual. They ventured out into the forest, the crisp air filling their lungs as they walked side by side. The world felt different now, lighter, somehow, as if the weight that had once burdened John was slowly lifting. Shadow walked with purpose, his steps steady and confident. John smiled as he watched the dog trot along beside him, his coat gleaming in the fading sunlight. There was a quiet rhythm to their steps, a silent understanding between them. They had both been through their own battles, and yet here they were, together, in this peaceful moment. As they walked deeper into the woods, John's mind drifted to the past. He thought about the days before Shadow came into his life, days filled with isolation, anger, and regret. He had been so focused on his pain, so consumed by his memories, that he hadn't realized how much he had been shutting out the world. But Shadow had changed that. The dog's loyalty, its unwavering presence, had reminded John that he didn't have to face his struggles alone. He wasn't broken, he was healing. They continued walking until they reached the edge of a small clearing. John paused for a moment, looking around at the tall trees and the quiet stillness of the forest. It felt like the world had slowed down here, as if time itself had taken a breath. Shadow trotted up to him and sat down at his feet, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes. John reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the warmth of the connection they shared. "We've made it this far, haven't we, buddy?" he said softly. Shadow's tail wagged in response, a silent affirmation of their journey together. The bond between them had grown deeper with each passing day. They had both been through their own struggles, their own pain, but now they had found something beautiful in each other. John had found a new sense of purpose, and it was all thanks to Shadow. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the clearing, John knew that this was just the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, but he no longer feared them. With Shadow by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had found healing, and together, they would face the future, one step at a time. As the days grew warmer, John found himself spending more time outside, tending to the land that had once felt like a burden. With Shadow by his side, every corner of the property seemed to come alive. The small, neglected garden that John had once ignored now flourished under his care, and the little house that had felt empty now echoed with laughter and companionship. Shadow had brought a sense of joy back into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. One afternoon, John decided to take a trip into town. It had been a while since he'd ventured beyond his property, and something told him it was time to reconnect with the world outside. Shadow, ever the loyal companion, sat in the passenger seat of the truck, his head resting on the window as they drove down the winding road. As they entered the small town, John couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed now. The people he passed by, the old shops and familiar faces, everything felt warmer, more inviting. He parked the truck and stepped out, Shadow following closely behind. As they walked through the town, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He greeted the locals, exchanging small talk with a few of the familiar faces, and even stopped to chat with an older couple who had always been kind to him. The simple act of reconnecting with others made John realize just how far he had come. He wasn't the same person who had walked into this town all those months ago, lost and broken. He had found something that had eluded him for years, connection. Shadow trotted happily beside him, his tail wagging as they made their way through the town square. John noticed how many people had stopped to smile at the dog, some even bending down to give Shadow a quick pet. It was clear that Shadow had made an impression on everyone he met, just as he had on John. As they reached the local cafe, John decided to stop for a coffee. He sat down at one of the outdoor tables, Shadow lying quietly beside him. As he sipped his drink, John looked around, taking in the sights and sounds of the town. For the first time in a long time, he felt at ease. Shadow had brought so much more into his life than he could have ever imagined. The little dog had healed a part of him that he thought was beyond repair. Shadow had shown him that no matter how dark the past may be, there was always a chance for a new beginning. And as John sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that this was just the start of a new chapter. With Shadow by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. The days continued to pass with a gentle rhythm, and John began to settle into a routine that felt right. The days were long, filled with quiet moments shared between him and Shadow. They spent their mornings outside, working together in the garden, and their afternoons exploring the woods that surrounded their home. John had never imagined how much joy could be found in such simple things. Each day, Shadow grew stronger, his coat shinier, and his energy boundless. It was clear that the puppy who had once been so frail and weak was now thriving. But it wasn't just Shadow who had changed. John had, too. His once bleak and lonely existence had been transformed by the bond they shared. He had found a sense of peace in the companionship of the small dog, a peace he hadn't known in years. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, John realized just how much he had come to depend on Shadow. The little dog had become more than just a pet. He had become a friend, a constant source of comfort and support. In the quiet moments, when the world seemed still, John found himself reflecting on all that he had gone through. The pain, the loss, the loneliness, it all seemed so far away now, like distant memories that no longer had the power to hurt him. Shadow had helped him heal in a way that he never could have imagined. John had spent so many years running from his emotions, burying them deep inside, but Shadow had shown him that it was okay to let go. It was okay to feel again. As the weeks went by, John found himself looking forward to the future in a way he hadn't in years. The weight of his past no longer held him back, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He and Shadow had created a life together, one filled with peace, love, and the simple joys of everyday life. On a particularly warm afternoon, John decided to take a trip to the lake nearby. He hadn't been there in years, but something about the calm waters and the peaceful surroundings felt like the perfect place to spend the day. Shadow, ever the eager companion, jumped into the truck without hesitation, wagging his tail excitedly. As they arrived at the lake, John parked the truck and got out, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. The scent of pine and earth filled his lungs, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped moving. Shadow trotted ahead, his paws kicking up the soft dirt as he ran toward the water. John smiled, watching the dog run free, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and gratitude. Shadow had come so far, and so had he. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake, John sat on a rock by the shore, Shadow lying next to him. The peace that had settled over him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. In that moment, John knew that he had found something worth holding on to, something that had been worth all the struggles and the pain. With Shadow by his side, he was ready to face whatever the future had in store. As the seasons continued to change, John found himself more and more at peace with his life. The quiet mornings with Shadow had become his favorite part of the day. Together, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunrise, and in those moments, John felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the simple life they had created. Shadow had brought so much more into his world than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the companionship or the comfort, it was the healing that had come with it. Each day, as they worked together in the garden or walked along the trails near their home, John realized just how much he had grown. The man who had once been consumed by memories of war and loss was no longer the same person. He was now someone who could look at the world around him and find joy in the small things, like the way Shadow's ears would perk up at the sound of birds singing or how the dog would chase after the falling leaves in the autumn breeze. One morning, after a long walk through the woods, John sat down on a fallen log, watching as Shadow ran ahead, his tail wagging in excitement. The crisp air carried the scent of pine, and the sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. John closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the soft crunch of Shadow's paws on the ground. It was in these quiet moments that John felt the most alive. He could hear the peaceful rhythm of the world around him, and it filled him with a sense of calm that he had never known before. Shadow returned to John's side, sitting next to him and looking up with those familiar amber eyes. The bond between them had only deepened over time. John had always known that a dog could offer companionship, but Shadow had shown him that there was so much more to it. The little dog had become his partner, his source of strength, and his reminder that no matter what happened in life, there was always hope. As the weeks passed, John began to think about the future more and more. He had come so far since that first day when he found Shadow under the floorboards. At that moment, he hadn't known how much the small, trembling puppy would change his life. Now, as he sat with Shadow in the forest, John realized that he was ready for whatever came next. The pain from his past, the regrets, the loneliness, they no longer had the hold on him that they once did. He had found healing, not just in himself, but through his connection with Shadow. One day, as the sun began to set, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, John and Shadow stood together at the edge of the woods, looking out at the horizon. The world seemed endless in that moment, filled with possibilities. John smiled, a deep sense of contentment settling over him. With Shadow by his side, he felt ready for whatever the future held. Together, they had found their way, and now, they would face the road ahead, side by side. As the months went by, John and Shadow settled into a life that was both simple and fulfilling. John's days, once filled with the weight of memories and regrets, now had purpose. He found peace in the rhythm of his daily routine, caring for the land, working in the garden, and spending quiet moments with Shadow. The bond between them had grown even stronger, and with each passing day, it became more evident that Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a companion, a source of comfort, and, in many ways, a reflection of John's own journey. One afternoon, after working in the garden, John sat on the porch, enjoying the warmth of the sun on his face. Shadow lay at his feet, content and relaxed, his tail gently thumping against the wooden deck. It was a peaceful moment, one that John had come to cherish. He thought about how far he had come since the day he found Shadow under the floorboards. Back then, he had been a man consumed by his past, struggling with the weight of loss and the scars of war. But now, as he sat there with Shadow by his side, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, John felt whole again. It wasn't just the bond with Shadow that had healed him, it was the quiet moments they shared, the simple acts of companionship, and the joy of living in the present. Shadow had taught him that life didn't have to be complicated. The happiness they shared was found in the small things, the morning walks through the woods, the quiet evenings on the porch, and the unconditional love between them. As the days turned into weeks, John began to notice something else. The people in the town had started to notice the change in him. Where once he had been distant and withdrawn, now he was more open, more engaged with those around him. He found himself talking to his neighbors, reconnecting with old friends, and even joining in on community events. He had never imagined that something as simple as having a dog could change his life so profoundly. Shadow had opened a door for him, one that he hadn't even realized was closed. One evening, after a long day of work, John sat on the porch with Shadow, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of purple and orange, and the air had a soft, cool breeze. Shadow was resting beside him, his head on John's lap. John ran his fingers through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth of his companion, and for a moment, everything felt right. He thought about the future, about the life he had now, the peace he had found, and the journey he had taken. It had been a long road, but it had led him to this moment, to this place, and to Shadow. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, John knew that with Shadow by his side, he was ready for whatever the future held. As the days continued to unfold, John and Shadow's bond only grew deeper, strengthened by the quiet rhythms of their daily lives. John had spent so much time running from his past, from the pain that had once defined him. But now, as he worked beside Shadow in the garden or walked through the woods, he realized that the peace he had found was something that no longer felt fragile or temporary. It was real, and it was here to stay. One morning, as John sat on the porch, watching the sunrise with Shadow lying at his feet, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The small house, the land that had once seemed overwhelming, now felt like a sanctuary. He had rebuilt his life piece by piece, and in doing so, he had found a new purpose. The quiet mornings were a time for reflection, a time to appreciate how far he had come. Shadow, always by his side, had become more than just a pet. The little dog was a reminder of resilience, of how life could still be good, even after the hardest of times. One afternoon, John decided to take a trip to the lake again, the place that had once felt so far away, both physically and emotionally. This time, as they made their way there, John felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had spent so many years avoiding his feelings, afraid to face them. But now, with Shadow by his side, he felt ready to embrace whatever came his way. At the lake, the air was fresh and crisp, the water shimmering in the afternoon sun. Shadow trotted ahead, his paws splashing through the shallows as he chased after a stick. John smiled, watching the dog play. It was moments like this, moments of simple joy, that reminded him how far he had come. Shadow's playful antics had a way of grounding him, of reminding him that there was still beauty in the world, still joy to be found. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, John and Shadow sat together on the shore, side by side. The world around them was peaceful, still, and for the first time in a long time, John felt truly at home. He had found healing in the most unexpected of places, in the loyalty of a dog, in the quiet moments spent together, and in the acceptance of his past. With Shadow by his side, John knew that he was no longer running from who he was. He had found peace, and it was something he would never take for granted again. As the last light of the day faded into the horizon, John felt ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that he was not alone. With Shadow, his loyal companion, beside him, he knew they would face it together. As the years went by, the seasons continued their quiet dance, and John's life, once filled with pain and isolation, now felt full of purpose and warmth. With Shadow at his side, John had rebuilt more than just a home. He had built a life, one that was grounded in love, companionship, and healing. The man who had once carried the weight of the world on his shoulders now walked with a sense of peace he had never known before. One particularly crisp autumn morning, John found himself standing in front of the small cabin he had spent so many years restoring. The wood was aged, the walls weathered by time, but it had become a sanctuary for him and Shadow. The land, once foreign and overwhelming, now felt like home. Shadow, his loyal companion, stood beside him, his tail wagging, ready for whatever the day would bring. John looked out across the property, the golden leaves of the trees gently falling to the ground, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth. The peace of the moment was almost overwhelming, and for a brief second, John allowed himself to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The quiet mornings spent with Shadow, the long walks through the woods, the simple joys of tending to the land. These were the things that had healed him. They had given him a new perspective, a new understanding of what it meant to live fully. As the sun rose higher in the sky, John turned to Shadow, who was looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes. They had been through so much together, and yet, in this moment, everything felt right. Shadow had been more than just a dog. He had been a constant source of support, a reminder that no matter how dark the past may have seemed, there was always a way forward. Shadow had taught John the true meaning of loyalty, of unconditional love, and of the strength that could be found in even the most unlikely places. Together, they had built a life that was not defined by the struggles of the past, but by the promise of tomorrow. As they stood there, side by side, John knew that he was ready for whatever the future held. There would be challenges, of course, but with Shadow by his side, John felt that they could face anything. The dog had shown him that no matter how hard the road, there was always a way through it, as long as you had someone to walk with. And as the breeze picked up, ruffling Shadow's fur, John smiled. For the first time in years, he was truly at peace, knowing that the journey he had started with Shadow would continue for as long as they both could walk it together. As the years passed, the bond between John and Shadow continued to grow, and the quiet life they had built together in the small cabin in the woods became everything John had ever hoped for. No longer burdened by the weight of his past, John found solace in the simplicity of his days. The mornings were peaceful, spent with Shadow by his side, working in the garden, or taking long walks through the woods. The quiet hum of nature surrounded them, and for the first time in years, John felt truly content. Shadow had become more than just a companion. He had become John's anchor, the steady presence that had helped him heal in ways he never thought possible. The dog's loyalty and love were constant reminders of the strength that could be found in relationships, whether human or animal. One afternoon, After spending the morning clearing some overgrown brush on the property, John sat down on a nearby log to rest. Shadow immediately came over and sat beside him, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes. John smiled and reached down to pet the dog's head. "You're a good boy, Shadow," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Shadow wagged his tail in response, clearly content with the attention. It was in these small moments that John realized just how much he had grown. He had come to understand that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. With Shadow by his side, John had found a way to let go of the past, to embrace the present, and to look forward to the future with hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape, John and Shadow sat on the porch, watching the world around them settle into the quiet of the night. The sound of crickets chirping filled the air, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. John felt a deep sense of peace as he sat there, his hand resting on Shadow's back. They had been through so much together, and now, in this moment, everything felt right. The world felt still, and the only thing that mattered was the quiet companionship they shared. John's heart was full, not just with gratitude for Shadow, but for the life they had created together. It was a life that was simple, yes, but rich in meaning and love. As the days continued to pass, John knew that whatever came next, he would face it with Shadow by his side. They had built something beautiful together, and John had come to realize that he had everything he needed. The past no longer held power over him, and the future, though uncertain, felt filled with possibilities. As they sat on the porch, watching the world drift by, John knew that he was no longer running from anything. He was exactly where he was meant to be, with the one friend who had never let him down, the dog who had saved his life in ways he would never fully understand. Together, they were ready for whatever the next chapter of their journey would bring. As the years continued to pass, John and Shadow found themselves in a rhythm that felt right. The days were long, but they were filled with purpose. The garden flourished under John's care, and the cabin, once empty and cold, now felt warm and alive. Shadow, now a strong and healthy dog, was always by his side, a constant companion in every task. The mornings, spent together in the garden or on long walks through the woods, had become John's favorite time of day. He would wake early, feeling the cool morning air on his face, and Shadow would be right there with him, tail wagging and ready to start the day. John had learned to appreciate the simplicity of these moments, the peace that came with working the land and enjoying the quiet solitude of the forest. One afternoon, as John sat on the porch after a long day of work, he looked out at the world around him. The trees were thick with leaves, the sunlight filtering through in soft, golden beams. He thought about how much had changed since the day Shadow had entered his life. He had been a different man back then, lost, struggling with memories of the past, and unsure of how to move forward. But now, with Shadow by his side, he felt like he had found a new path, one that was filled with hope and possibility. The quiet moments with Shadow had allowed him to heal in ways he hadn't even realized he needed. He had found peace not in the grand gestures or the dramatic changes, but in the small, everyday moments they shared. Shadow's presence had grounded him, helped him reconnect with the world around him, and reminded him that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, John and Shadow stood on the porch, watching the world around them. The air had a cool, crisp quality to it, signaling the arrival of fall. Shadow, ever alert, was watching the shadows in the yard, ears perked and tail gently swaying. John chuckled softly, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. "You're always on guard, aren't you, buddy?" he said, his voice filled with affection. Shadow looked up at him with those familiar amber eyes, and for a moment, they simply stood there together, enjoying the quiet of the evening. John knew that this was exactly where he was meant to be. The past no longer haunted him, and the future no longer filled him with fear. He had found a sense of peace and purpose in the life he had built with Shadow, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly content. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. He had come so far, and he was finally at a place where he could embrace whatever came next. With Shadow by his side, he knew that whatever the future held, he was ready for it. As the years passed, John and Shadow's lives continued to intertwine, each day bringing new joys and quiet challenges. The once empty cabin, now full of life, had become a symbol of everything they had built together. John had found something he never thought possible: true contentment. He woke every morning with a sense of purpose, knowing that the day ahead would be spent with Shadow, in the peace they had created in their little corner of the world. Shadow, the once fragile puppy who had been saved from the shadows of John's past, was now a strong, vibrant dog, his coat shiny and his eyes bright with energy. The dog had become the anchor that John had needed, a constant reminder that life could still surprise him in the best possible ways. One morning, as John worked on the small garden near the house, Shadow bounded over to him, tail wagging furiously. John stopped, crouching down to greet his faithful companion. "You never get tired of this, do you?" he asked, laughing as Shadow nuzzled his hand. The dog's excitement was contagious, and for a moment, John forgot about the work at hand. It was in moments like this that John realized how much Shadow had brought into his life, not just a companion, but a friend who had helped him rediscover the simple pleasures of living. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the bond between them only deepened. They spent their days walking through the woods, enjoying the quiet beauty of nature, and their nights by the fire, content in each other's company. John had come to realize that, in some ways, Shadow had healed him more than he could have ever imagined. The dog had shown him that even the most painful chapters could lead to new beginnings, that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the landscape, John and Shadow sat on the porch, watching the sky change colors. The world was peaceful, the air cool and crisp, and for the first time in years, John felt truly at ease. He looked over at Shadow, who was resting at his feet, content and calm. It was in that moment that John knew without a doubt that he had found his home, his peace, and his purpose. He had found it not in grand achievements, but in the simple moments shared with the dog who had been his constant companion. As the stars began to appear in the sky, John felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. Life had taken him on a long, difficult journey, but with Shadow by his side, he had found a path that led him to where he needed to be. They had built something together, a life filled with love, companionship, and healing. And as the night grew darker and the world around them settled into quiet stillness, John knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with Shadow by his side, ready for the next chapter in their journey together.